When you grow up in the Jewish community, one thing that was pretty important was we should support Israel. Why? We were told, this is when I was a kid, that we were told to support Israel because we're Jews. There was no conversation or questioning about what does that mean. Like anyone who opens their eyes in the last 2 years and has seen the devastation and the violence, mass killing in Gaza, how would anyone look at that and not feel profound contempt towards Israel, the perpetrators of those crimes? It made sense that this blind tribal support for Israel that was common in the Jewish community was deeply, not just unhealthy, but blind. For many Jews, Israel has become their religion. It's replaced Judaism. I used to hear within my own family profound and deep racism towards Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims. My father is alive. He has lost many friends, even since October 7. He had a Jewish friend who said to him, "We need to gas them." Now, what does that mean? The idea that that would be your trauma response. Let's gas Palestinians. This idea that I was told when I was growing up, that Israel is our sort of safe space. It is more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel than arguably anywhere else in the world. There needs to be a Jewish reckoning for what has been done.
Antony Loewenstein, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so the first question, for those that are not familiar with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
So I am an Australian, Jewish, German, atheist journalist. I'll explain what that means in a minute. How could I be Jewish and atheist? I guess I define myself as a Jewish atheist, which might sound strange to a Muslim community, but I am culturally Jewish, but not religious. I don't really go to synagogue. I don't believe in God, but I have an affinity culturally with Judaism, and I think there are growing numbers of secular Jews globally who share this view, particularly in the last decades. It doesn't mean I don't have feelings about maintaining or continuing the Jewish faith, but I don't personally practice it. I was born in Melbourne in the mid-70s. I spent half my life, I'm now 51, in Melbourne, but I've been an international journalist, foreign correspondent, written a number of books around Israel-Palestine, around the war on drugs, around the war in Afghanistan. I have almost one foot in the mainstream and one foot in more independent media. I spent many years being based in Palestine. If someone does know me watching this, they might know me from my work around Israel-Palestine as someone who's a very constant Jewish critic of Israel, long before October 7, but certainly since. And I now live in Sydney, and that's probably a good summary.
Thank you for that. So again, as you mentioned, you're Jewish, yet you're also a supporter of the Palestinian cause. Why is that?
When I was growing up in the Jewish community, I was in Melbourne, and it's not that different now. There are some exceptions, of course, but in general, when you grow up in the Jewish community, grew up in a liberal Jewish home. It wasn't overly religious. We did go to synagogue on the Jewish holidays, Jewish New Year, some other holidays. We used to mark the Sabbath on the Friday night for us as Jews with my parents and family. But in general, it wasn't an overly religious family. But one thing that was pretty important and said to be important was we should support Israel. Why? Most of my family were killed in the Holocaust by the Nazis. The family that got out came to Australia and America and escaped wherever they could in the 1930s, late 1930s. And Israel we were told, this is when I was a kid, as a safe haven. For those who aren't aware, if I, as a Jew, go to Israel tomorrow, and I've spent a lot of time there, but I'm not a citizen, but if I go to Israel and say, I want to become a citizen, if I can prove my Jewishness, meaning that it goes through the mother, so if I can prove that I'm Jewish and I was born Jewish, then I can become a citizen and get a passport within 2, 3, 4 months. Something I've never done for political reasons. And, when you're 10 years old, that maybe makes sense. That logic about wanting to have a safe place that Jews can go to maybe made sense when I was that age. But as time went on, there was something about it which I used to hear within my own family, profound and deep racism towards Arabs, Palestinians, and Muslims. And this was often from people who'd never spent time with Arabs, Palestinians, or Muslims. What does that mean? Well, let's say there was a suicide bombing in Jerusalem at the time. This would be in the 1990s, 1980s. And we were told by my family, by the rabbis in the synagogue, by the community, Yasser Arafat, who was then the leader of the Palestinians, he's like Hitler. The Palestinians are like the Nazis. This is what I'm told over and over and over again. Now, when you're 10 years old, maybe you don't have much of a knowledge to maybe challenge that. But as time went on, when I was in my early teens, this just seemed irrational, and just I felt very uncomfortable about that. And when I look back now, what became very clear to me is that I have no recollection of meeting a Palestinian until my 20s. Now, it's possible I did, but I don't remember. And that's the case for the majority of the Jewish community, then and now. And I think if you don't meet, it's obvious to say this, but if you don't meet a Palestinian, if you don't meet an Arab, if you don't meet a Muslim, and obviously we're all meeting people all the time, we often don't know who they are, sort of, in their private life. But if you're not meeting someone and having a conversation about this, about what Palestinians think and how they feel, and then your knowledge is based on either ignorance or racism, frankly. You are able to, as the Jewish community, generalize and discriminate against Palestinians because they are framed as a threat to us as Jews. There are only 16, 17 million Jews in the world. It's a very small population. Roughly half in Israel, half in the US, and the rest scattered around the world, Australia, Europe, etc. So it's a pretty small compared to billions of Muslims. There are very, very few Jews. Obviously a lot to do with the Holocaust and various other reasons. So for me, as I was growing up and I became more knowledgeable, it made sense that this blind tribal support for Israel that was common in the Jewish community was deeply, not just unhealthy, but blind. That we were told to support Israel because we're Jews. There was no conversation or questioning about what does that mean? Are you supporting the occupation of Palestine? Are you supporting the discrimination? We didn't really get to that point. But if you did have that conversation, and I have it obviously with Jews a lot now, those who still support Israel, they are able to defend and support policies they would never support in their own country. Meaning they would not at least vocalize, for example, in Sydney or Melbourne or London or New York or London or Paris, the idea that you have two separate systems, one for Jews and one for someone else. That would be discriminatory and outrageous, and how could you even suggest that in a democracy? Whereas in Israel, it's just normal. We have no choice. They're trying to kill us. Well, we have to protect ourselves as Jews. And if that means that, 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are treated like crap, well, then too bad. That's the price for Jewish safety. And in the end, just finally, I realized as time went on, I was increasingly disillusioned with my family, not so much my parents, but the wider cousins that I had, that in fact, what was being done in my name as a Jew in Israel and Palestine, in fact, was making us less safe. In fact, it was increasing anti-Semitism. And again, this was a thought long before October 7 and what's happened since. So it's been a long journey, is the short answer.
Right. You said you hadn't met a Palestinian until you hit the age of 20.
Roughly, I have no recollection of who that person was when I met them, to be honest, but I don't have, I say that because it's important for people to realize, and this is maybe not massively different to many in the Muslim community who don't meet Jews, at least not knowingly, right, which is a problem,
of course,
is that you're able to talk about the people rather than talk to them. So when I was growing up in my family synagogue, which was a relatively liberal place, conversations that I was hearing from the rabbi that I would hear at the synagogue when they're giving sermons, my family, Jewish friends. I went to a Jewish youth group, which was fairly Zionist. It wasn't saying we should move to Israel tomorrow, but this is the water that you're kind of bathing in, so to speak, that this was normal. I have no recollection of Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims at all. And this obviously was in the 1980s. It has changed a little bit, but when I speak to young Jews now who often write to me in distress about the fact that they've been brainwashed at their Jewish school or synagogue.
Does that happen a lot?
It still happens a lot. And in some ways the last 2 years for some people have made this worse, because the framing of October 7, that attack on Israel, was framed by Israel itself, by Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and many of Israel's advocates, as essentially, this is akin to Nazi Germany. The argument being Hamas wanted to kill all of us, they couldn't, but they tried. Hamas the Nazis, which is what Netanyahu has openly said. This is not to defend October 7. I think it was, in my view, a war crime. But the targeting of Israeli civilians is a war crime. But there's a context for why these things happen. Hamas didn't wake up one morning and just say, I want to kill Jews. I mean, these are people who've been living in Gaza. I've spent time in Gaza as a reporter. Gaza is under a brutal military occupation by Israel. And this explains people's radicalism towards Israelis, towards Westerners. They're not targeting Jews because they're Jews. They're targeting Israelis because they are the face of the occupation. So for a lot of Jews in Australia that I speak to, the ones who maybe got brought up in a more traditional or more conservative environment, when you are told day after day after day in your community, in your schools, on social media, if you're following those kinds of accounts, that essentially it's open season on Jews, that Palestinians, many Muslims want to kill us. And again, it's a zero-sum game. It's us or them. And we need to protect ourselves. Now, of course, what that has meant in practice has been Israel's committed genocide in Gaza. And here we are 2+ years on. And in fact, if anything, it's made, in my view, global Jewish community far less secure than it was before, because you are, as a Jewish state, which claims to speak for me as a Jew, it has shown that there are no limits to what Israel will do, torturing, killing, murdering, raping Palestinians in just insane numbers. How could that in any way make us safer as Jews? It's just absurd.
So in that journey, what pushbacks and conflicts did you come across?
A lot. I mean, the short version is, for many in the Jewish community, I am an outcast, which doesn't bother me. But certainly when I started being more questioning, this was when I was maybe in my late teens, I remember raging arguments with my family, including my parents, about, I would regularly say or ask, why is there this knee-jerk, blind defense of everything Israel does, which, by the way, I think was often based on ignorance. I was growing up at a time, this might be hard to some viewers to understand, this is before the internet. So what you're finding out about the world is really through mainstream media or maybe Jewish media. And Jewish media, with exceptions, is very pro-Zionist, very pro-Israel, which hasn't radically changed. Of course, there's now lots of websites and social media which is more critical of Israel, but the more mainstream Jewish media outlets, the Australian Jewish News being the biggest Jewish newspaper in the country, is radically pro-Israel, pro-settler, pro-Netanyahu, pro-genocide, still. Now, I'm not saying every single Jew reads that newspaper every week, but that's the mood, that's the atmosphere. So what pushback? Lost certain Jewish friends, apart from my mother's now passed away, but my father is alive. He is very much on side, but he's gone through a long journey. He has lost many friends, even since October 7. He told me a story days after October 7. He lives in Melbourne. He had a Jewish friend who said to him, and I'm paraphrasing here, something like, we need to gas them. Now, what does that mean? We, being Israel, needs to gas them, being Palestinians. I think about a Jew talking about, now, yes, this person's in Melbourne, they're not making policy, but the idea that that would be your trauma response, let's gas Palestinians, apart from the historical outrage that says that Jews themselves were gassed by the Nazis in World War II, that the so-called solution here is that Jews or Israel should gas Palestinians, whether they're Christian or Muslim, is just insane. And he's lost that friend. He says to me, you can't come back from that. I mean, yes, the person could apologize and say they were upset, which they never did. So that friendship and other ones have gone. I mean, in other ways, my first book came out in 2006, My Israel Question, which was a critical journalistic investigation into both Israel-Palestine, but also the pro-Israel lobby and how it tries to censor critical voices. And a year before the book came out, it had been announced that it was being written. You have parliamentarians in Parliament saying the book should be banned. The book hadn't been written. I mean, what? which of course helped book sales in the end, by the way. When the book comes out, the pro-Israel lobby is putting pressure on my then publisher, Melbourne University Press in Melbourne, to pulp the book, which they thankfully did not. I mean, and when I look back in hindsight, the book itself was not radical. It was challenging Israel. It was talking at the time about a two-state solution, which I don't believe in anymore, but it was not some radical book by any means. But it was clearly seen as a major threat. I wasn't the first Jew in Australia to be critical of Israel publicly. That's nonsense. But for whatever the reason, I was getting a lot of traction back then in 2003, 4, 5, 6, saying these things. So I was getting hate mail and death threats, mostly from Jews, which has not changed. I don't so much get death threats now, but a lot of hate mail from, I think, still principally Jews all over the world, who regularly call me things like a traitor. There's this term called capo, which you might not know what that means. A capo was a Jew during Nazi era times who worked with the Nazis in the hope that they would be saved. So a collaborator, essentially. And it's very common for Jews who are supporting Palestine to be called that. So essentially you're being told, which is offensive and I ignore it, that you are no different to a Nazi collaborator. Meaning what? That supporting Palestinians means that I'm supporting the Nazis? I mean, that's the implication, which is, bonkers, and I ignore that. But so yeah, look, a lot of hate, but it's worth saying the vast majority of messages I get are supportive, including from Jews. And many in the Muslim community who regularly say to me, we didn't know these, you didn't know that Jews like you exist. Which is not surprising because so much of the Jewish establishment still, when you see them in the media, is basically saying Israel right or wrong, Netanyahu is great, we should bomb them more, Palestinians. I mean, this is what people are hearing. And I think that to me is leading to actual anti-Semitism.
You're Jewish and you're anti-Zionist. You often hear remarks such as 95% of Jewish people being Zionist. Therefore, being anti-Zionist is the same as being an anti-Semite. What do you think about that?
Well, it's nonsense, and it's completely ahistorical because, firstly, Israel didn't exist until 1948. Zionism wasn't around as an ideology until the late 1800s. So this idea somehow that it's just normal to be Zionist is absurd. Historically, Jews have been around for thousands of years before anything like Zionism existed, or Israel existed for that matter in its current form. Secondly, there's growing numbers of studies, particularly in the US, UK and Australia, of younger Jews especially. This was happening before October 7, but certainly since, who their views are, if they're not necessarily anti-Zionist, although some are, they are deeply opposed to Israel's policies against the Palestinians. And I think I see Zionism now as a cult, honestly. It's a semi-popular cult, but it's a cult. And the argument being, if you're not part of our group, our cult, you're ostracized. And what's happening in many parts of the global Jewish community is that as Israel itself becomes more and more extreme, more proudly theocratic and racist and discriminatory and supremacist, blind supporters in the West have to go along with that and become more far right themselves. So it's not accidental the growing numbers of young Jews particularly look to Israel and their open partnership with the global far right across Europe, Germany, France, Sweden, England. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, Tommy Robinson, a far-right extremist from the UK, is invited by the Israeli government to go to Israel as a friend, to show his followers in the UK, I guess principally, although anywhere online, why the West should support Israel. Now, there are lots of other examples I can give you, but that's in some ways the one that crystallizes it. This is not a group, this is the Israeli government proudly inviting a bigot who hates Muslims, whose vision, if you can call it that, is a deeply discriminatory ethno-nationalist Christian state in the UK, which is why he loves Israel. And if you are a proud Zionist and you don't see a problem with that, then you have a problem. Because What Israel itself is becoming, and as a journalist, we never want to predict the future because who the hell knows what's going to happen, but Israel is likely to become a proudly theocratic state in the coming decades, meaning that a proudly Jewish supremacist state now already is that, but it's not, for example, like Saudi Arabia yet, where, a lot of the Arab Muslim countries discriminate against non-Muslims, which I have a problem with, and I've spoken about that very openly for years. I have a problem with any ethno-nationalist state. I've done a lot of work on India, which is a chauvinistic Hindu fundamentalist state which discriminates against 200 million Muslims. So the issue to me is not just Israel as a Jewish state. Any state that discriminates against those who are not the so-called majority is a problem. It's not democratic. So the idea somehow that Jews who claim, or anyone who claims to be anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, this is to me a sign of desperation, that we are told that we being as anti-Zionists, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, that somehow that makes you anti-Semitic. It's a way to silence you, to shut you up. Who wants to be accused of being anti-Semitic? No one wants to be accused of it, of course. But it's cheapening what anti-Semitism means and the battle that necessarily has to be against real Jew haters who exist in the world. I'm not denying that for a second. But the idea that you simply oppose Israeli genocide or occupation, or you're opposed to endless occupation, somehow makes you an anti-Semite is absurd, and many Jews reject that, as they should.
That figure that I mentioned from that question, 95% of Jewish people being Zionist, do you think there's any truth to that?
In Australia?
Globally?
No, I don't think that's true. And I say that because there are growing studies being done in the UK, the US. There's not as up-to-date information about Australia. It's a relatively small population here. The Jewish population is about 120,000, roughly. It's quite small. Obviously much bigger in the US and the UK and parts of Europe. And most studies in the last years, again, before October 7, but even much more since, have shown, particularly with the 18 to 35 demographic, growing not just disillusionment and anger and contempt for Israel, but a growing belief that our future as Jews should not be tied to Israel. This idea that I was told when I was growing up, that Israel is our sort of safe space, God forbid something happens again to Jews, it's just an absurdity. I mean, it's worth saying, just on the record, it is more unsafe to be a Jew in Israel than arguably anywhere else in the world. Now, what does that say to you about the supposed safety of Israel as a Jewish state? It's just a lie. It's just not true. And Israeli actions are making all of us, in my view, more unsafe. Like anyone who opens their eyes in the last 2 years and has seen the horrors and the devastation and the violence, mass killing in Gaza by Israel, let alone in Lebanon and Syria and the West Bank, of course, which is now on fire more than it has been in the past. How would anyone look at that objectively and not get profoundly angry and contempt? How would anyone look at that and not feel profound contempt towards Israel, the perpetrators of those crimes? So many young Jews feel the same way. They may have been brought up like me to be brainwashed, to believe in this concept that we as Jews have to stick together and Israel is somehow our savior. But it's just not true. It's just tangibly not true. And it's, historically at least, it's much better and safer to be secure in wherever we are living, US, England, Australia, wherever. Again, not to deny anti-Semitism. It's real. But Israel is hardly a secure homeland when it is bombarding and killing and massacring Palestinians, as if somehow that's a Jewish identity we should be proud of. It should not.
On that note, a recent poll survey held earlier this year found that American Jewish people held surprising sentiments on Palestine and Israel. It revealed that over 60% of Jewish Americans believe that Israel has committed war crimes, and almost 40% believe they're committing genocide. Is there an awakening amongst Jewish people?
Well, that poll was amazing. It was published in the Washington Post, I think, a few months ago, and revealed the lie that somehow says that if you're a Jew and you are against Israeli actions, you're an anti-Semite. Now, all those people might not be anti-Zionist. I don't think the poll asked that question. But when you had a majority of American Jews polled saying that Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza, which they have, when you have Israeli soldiers themselves talking about the crimes that they have been committing, when 40%, whatever the figure exactly was, said Israel was committing genocide, which again is absolutely correct, you are having what I call a schism in the Jewish community. As I've been saying this for a long time, and it was happening before October 7, but it's even clearer now. There is a growing civil war in the Jewish community. It's a non-violent civil war, mostly happening in the US and UK and increasingly here. It's not quite as neat as this, but in general, between an old generation and a younger generation. A younger generation of Jews looks at what Israel is doing, what it stands for, who it appoints, who Israeli Jews vote for. A government in Israel now, for example, which is proudly racist, chauvinist. You have ministers like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who are, I call them neo-Nazis. They're neo-Nazis. There's no other way to describe them. This is who Israel has voted for. Doesn't mean every Israeli agrees with them, they don't. But this is who they are. People sort of say, if someone puts their face forward, don't ignore them. This is what they are. This is who they are. This is what they stand for. This is their vision. Their vision is a Jewish-only state that does not believe that non-Jews have equal rights. That's Israel today. So those poll figures are reflective of what so many people, Jew and non-Jew, have seen on their phones the last 2 years. The massacres, the genocide in Gaza, that people are angry, they're outraged, and increasingly they are disillusioned, rightly, with their leaders. That still today, in 2025, the vast majority of so-called Jewish leaders, the pro-Israel lobby, other Jewish organizations, remain 100% in lockstep with Israel. So where does that leave you as a young Jew if you want to have some involvement in the Jewish community? Do you try to enter those organizations and change them, which I think is futile? Or do you try to build up new ones? Do you say, these organizations that have been around forever are going to try to morally blackmail us and say, Israel right or wrong? If you want to enter through this door, you support Israel. I'm sorry, that's just not acceptable in 2025. It wasn't acceptable ever, but it's not acceptable now after what we have seen. And what needs to happen, and it's something that I'm involved with in a way, is there needs to be a Jewish reckoning for what has been done in our name. Now, I wasn't obviously involved in anything in Gaza. I'm simply a Jew living in Sydney. But the Jewish reckoning, which is required to understand and grapple with what has been done in Gaza particularly, but beyond, will be generational. That unless there is that reckoning, unless there is that Jewish acceptance of these profound crimes and accountability, it's worth saying this briefly on this point, there is still denial about what happened in 1948. You speak to many mainstream Jews, they'll sort of say, the homeland was just founded. There was no discrimination, there was no ethnic cleansing. This would be like an Australian saying that there was no genocide against black Australians. It's just delusional and just simply wrong. And yet, many in the Jewish community haven't accepted what happened in 1948 now, this is decades later, there's denialism about that. It's going to take a long time, based on that, to grapple with what's been happening in the last 2 years. So I am encouraged by the growing numbers of Jews who are speaking out, who are critical, who are involved in America in groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, or If Not Now. I'm involved in Australia with the Jewish Council of Australia, which founded in early 2024, soon after the October 7 attacks, and is trying to build both a more inclusive, progressive Jewish space, which is fundamentally opposed to Israeli actions, while at the same time reaching out to other communities, especially the Muslim community, and saying that it is vital for us to show as Jews that not all Jews support this. We are not in lockstep with the Netanyahu government or the Israeli state. And too much of, over the years, so-called interfaith work, particularly between Christians and Muslims, too much of the interfaith work over the years, particularly between Jews and Muslims, to me, has been based on a lie. It's important that Muslims and Jews get along. I've got no problem with that. But if you sort of box Palestine and say, oh, it's a bit too complicated. We can't really talk about that because, well, you know, we're Jews and we love Israel, but you Muslims don't love Israel. We'll just park that. Well, sure, not everything is Palestine, of course, other issues in the world, but this is a fundamental issue that many Jews and Muslims want to talk about and reckon with. And I think that many in the Jewish establishment, pro-Israel lobby, are lying to themselves if they believe that they can simply restart interfaith dialogue when they have spent the last 2 years demonizing Palestinians as all terrorists, that all Gazans somehow are deserving of death, which is what both they often say publicly and what the Israeli government has been saying. So I think those organizations are beyond repair. And many young Jews feel exactly the same way. They don't speak for us. They don't represent us. They are deeply racist. They're unaccountable. I didn't vote for the Executive Council of Australian Jewry or AJAC or the Zionist Federation. They don't speak for me as a Jew, and they don't speak for most Jews because they're deeply racist organizations against Muslims particularly. And that to me should shame us, not make us proud.
What we can see from this poll is that Israel is definitely losing the grip of the global narrative of what they would prefer. As they continue to lose this grip, what can we expect from Israel?
A lot of propaganda, a lot of what they call hasbara, which is sort of explaining themselves. In this year, 2025, Israel is spending $150 million US more on propaganda. What does that mean practically? Well, it means sending a lot of influencers to Israel to say how wonderful it is. A lot of Trump supporting influencers from the US particularly. It means sending people like Tommy Robinson, who they think, in my view, delusionally, is going to somehow convince people that we in the West are in the same war against Islam that Israel is. It means putting massive pressure on social media companies to censor and ban content they don't like, which is pro-Palestine. It means, for example, the likely incoming owner of TikTok, Oracle, the majority owner that Trump wants to appoint, is a pro-Israel fanatic as an organization. So the algorithm, I guess, will be skewed to make it less favorable to pro-Palestine voices. I mean, I'm, I guess, not convinced that any of this is going to work. And why? Because people can't unsee what they have seen. You can explain it, you can defend it, you can justify it, you can say, well, we had no choice to bomb every hospital because they're all full of terrorists, or we can say that, you know, the Israeli soldiers who talk about raping Palestinians, well, what choice did they have? I don't think people buy that. You could spend $100 billion, and I'm not convinced enough people will buy that. Where it could be, though, a narrative that is accepted is not so much with so-called liberals in the West, who I think mostly have given up on Israel. But evangelical Christians and more religious Orthodox Jews are still very pro-Israel. And the so-called far-right movement and the MAGA movement in the US, which although is increasingly split over Israel, are, I would say, mostly still in love with the idea of Israel. And again, for this concept that of being a proud ethno-nationalist state, and we should mimic that in our own countries. So Israel's going to spend a lot of propaganda money, and you will see a lot of journalists and influencers being taken over there and having their hand held and saying, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? There's no apartheid here. There's no genocide here. Here's a Palestinian we just found off the street, and to say, I love Israel, great country, big fan. That's what you can expect. And I just don't think it's going to work.
Mm-hmm. What is it about Zionism and Israeli ideology that makes it so easy to dehumanize Palestinians?
It's in its DNA. That the idea of having a Jewish majority state, particularly in Palestine, means that you cannot have Palestinians who have self-determination. I mean, from the beginning, the early Zionist writings from the late 1800s, reading it today in 2025, reveals a deeply racist thought. We are superior people, Jews. We have the right to the homeland, even though at that point, and even in 1948, the majority of people there were not Arab. Sorry. even in 1948 it was clear that the majority were not Jews, there is a deeply racist, dehumanizing belief within Zionism, and sadly amongst many in the Jewish community, that does not see Arabs as equal people, that somehow says because of us being when I was growing up, I was told that we were the chosen people. Now, what does that do to your mindset if you believe that? Well, if you're the chosen people, you can pretty much do what you want. Now, obviously, this was in the context, although when Zionism was founded, this is before the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, now we're told anything can be justified because of what happened to us, and how dare you criticize us, because if you do, you're a Nazi. And Zionist ideology, Zionist thinking, and I see this all the time online from so-called pro-Israel forces, pro-Israel voices, the pro-Israel lobby in Australia, the Israeli government, that we as Jews, Israelis, have the right to basically dominate Palestinians for our safety. This is not about you, this is about us. And don't you dare criticize us because of what you in the West did to us in the past. So if you'd asked me 25 years ago, I wouldn't have given you the same answer. Not that I was supporting Zionism, I wasn't, but knowing a lot more now about the early Zionist writings, and it's amazing when you read that early Zionist writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s to today, not much has changed. The world has changed, the power balances have changed, there's no Ottoman Empire, there's no real British Empire anymore. Things have changed. There wasn't a Holocaust then. But the thinking, the contempt that too many Zionists have towards Arabs runs through the whole time for over 100 years now, and that has not changed. And that's why, to me, it's so toxic and we should reject it, in my view. For many Jews, Israel has become their religion. It's replaced Judaism. So, yes, you have religious Jews who obviously believe in the Torah and pray, and fine. But for many liberal, progressive, secular Jews who support Israel, this is their religion. This is their thinking. This is their job, so to speak. This is their thinking, that our role as Jews needs to be to support Israel uncritically, which of course to me is disastrous. And I think for too often, this is why people like me and others are trying to separate Zionism and Judaism. They are not the same thing. For too many Jews, they say there is no difference. You cannot be a Jew and not be a Zionist, which is nonsense. You can be a Jew, as growing numbers of Jews are, who fundamentally reject the idea that Jewish nationalism, Jewish militarism, supremacy is the only way we can live and survive as Jews. I mean, that's what Israel is. And I would argue that's what Israel has always been. And it's something that we should reject. So, where does the concept of Jewish supremacy come from? I mean, there's elements in the certain Jewish texts that could be read in that way. And certainly within Zionist ideology from the beginning, dehumanizing Arabs was there from day one. And I think it's something that many Jews are having to unlearn, because when they grow up, they hear this day in, day out. And especially if you go to Jewish schools, if you spend time in the mainstream Jewish community, if you hear, I saw, just the last few months was the major Jewish holidays of the year, Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And I was sent a number of sermons by rabbis in Australia and the US and elsewhere. Now, obviously, I don't want to generalize. There are a lot of rabbis who don't share these views, but in general, they were vile. They were racist against Arabs, against Palestinians. This is what rabbis are preaching to their congregation. I'm not even talking about in religious spaces. I'm talking about they were in synagogues, but relatively liberal spaces. Supporting Israel, supporting Netanyahu, praying for the IDF, fundraising for the IDF, encouraging Australian young Jews to join the IDF. Again, I'm generalizing. I'm not saying everyone's doing this, but that moral failure of so much in the Jewish community is outrageous, and I think speaks to the moral rot that exists amongst so many in the Jewish community, that 2 years into a genocide, it's seen as normal for a rabbi on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar to praise Israeli soldiers in Gaza. I mean, can you imagine the cognitive dissonance that is required to do that? You either don't know what's going on, which is inexcusable, or you do know what's going on, and it's also inexcusable. Like, what are we defending? Mass killing and rapes of Palestinian prisoners? I mean, is that what we're defending here? So, yeah, the Jewish community in many ways is really broken. And although that's a problem, this is a unique moment to have, as I said, that Jewish reckoning, which is so required, which frankly should have happened long before October 7. But now it's more needed than ever.
That's really eye-opening. You actually lived in occupied Palestine within the West Bank yourself for over 4 years. What was that experience like?
Yeah, so I first went to Israel, Palestine in 2005, and every 2 or 3 years I would go back to report either from Israel, the West Bank or Gaza. Between 2016 and 2020 I lived in East Jerusalem. My partner, she was working there for an international NGO and I was doing journalism. And look, when we moved there, decided to move there, we made the decision together that we did not want to live in West Jerusalem. For those who don't know what that means, West Jerusalem is predominantly Israeli Jewish. There are some Arabs there, of course, but why? Because it just seemed morally suspect to be living in that place. It doesn't mean we never went there to, go to a cafe or something. We did, of course. I mean, there's no sort of official border, so to speak, between West and East Jerusalem, generally. But to live amongst Palestinians to us seemed like the morally correct choice. Look, there was rarely a day that went past when I did not see, and my partner did not see, Israeli police harassing Palestinians in the area. Happened virtually every day. For no reason. Because they could. Because they were bored. Because they're racist. Whatever the reason. And it enrages you. Because this is being done in my name, really. Not that I associate with Israel, but it's being done as Israel claims to speak for all Jews, which is nonsense, but that's what they say. So look, living there, I guess that was the downside. On the other hand, look, it was an amazing experience. It was, met incredible people, spent a lot of reporting trips in Gaza. Certain Palestinian friends of ours from Gaza are now living in Australia. They'd arrived here after October 7 as refugees, essentially, and were able to get out when it was possible to do so. And so, yeah, those ties have been ties that were made in that period in Palestine have continued long after we have left. And the last time I was in Palestine was late last year. Obviously Gaza, there's no international journalists being allowed in, but I went to Israel and the West Bank and things were bad. Things have always been bad in the West Bank, but there was just a lot of Palestinians were scared, understandably. They worried that what was happening in Gaza would happen to them in the West Bank. And the ethnic cleansing and forced removal of Palestinians in the West Bank is accelerating. Violence against Palestinians by crazy settlers backed by the state. Things are grim, which doesn't get nearly enough attention in the Western press. But yeah, I'm glad I did it. And in some weird way, it made me both more proud to be Jewish, but also much more ashamed. More ashamed for the obvious reasons, because this is being done in my name. I'm seeing these horrible crimes. I'm reporting on these horrible crimes committed by Israeli forces or settlers against Palestinians. And proud in a way to realize that there's a growing opposition to it. Not so much within Israel, which is tiny, but globally, amongst Jews and others. And again, this was long before October 7.
In your book, The Palestine Laboratory, you say, and I quote, "I was raised to believe Israel was my homeland, but I have come to realize it never was and it never will be. My homeland is not built on the dispossession of another people." How do you respond to people claiming that they have a sacred birthright to Palestine?
You mean Jews?
Yeah.
Well, they mostly don't. They might think they do. And I'm not someone who says there's never been a Jewish connection to the land. There is a Jewish connection historically to parts of Palestine. No one who knows history can deny that. That's true. Obviously, Muslims, Arabs have been in that area on and off for thousands of years, as have some Jews. I mean, that's just a historical fact. However, it's a very important however, that doesn't give a Jew a right, for example, to go, as I can tomorrow, and become an Israeli citizen, when a Palestinian who has far more connection to the land cannot, which is a key reason why over the years I have not become an Israeli citizen. I mean, I have no desire for an Israeli passport. It's pretty useless around the world anyway. But beyond that, I think it's morally and ethically deeply problematic to be getting a passport and get citizenship for a state that actively discriminates and hates non-Jews. What am I getting the passport for? To simply make me feel more Jewish, which I wouldn't do at all. I'd be ashamed to have that passport. So, when I wrote that as I was growing up, we were told that Israel was our homeland. It's kind of a weird thing in a way, because on the one hand, there was never a serious suggestion that someone like me would move to Israel. And yet it was this, I often saw that the image that we were being sold was a fantasy Israel. This kind of thriving democracy. This is what we got told. It's a thriving democracy. Arabs can vote. And yeah, Arabs can vote in Israel. That's true. But they're profoundly discriminated against, which sort of ignores the 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who are always kind of, well, it's complicated. We have to have checkpoints for our security. I mean, you could justify occupation forever in that way, right? And as I often say, I think I say this in the book, but Israel and Jews will never have safety until Palestinians do. It's really as simple as that. So if you as a state and a people think that bombarding and killing and occupying another people will bring you security and safety, you're delusional. Because actually the opposite is happening. Long before October 7 and certainly since.
Well, how did mainstream media outlets and social platforms react to the release of the Palestine Laboratory? Did you encounter any attempts at censorship or distortion?
The book came out initially in May 2023, so a few months before October 7, and the book obviously is not about October 7, but at the end of the book, and I'm not for a second suggesting I predicted the attack, I did not, but at the end of the book, I say something like, I and Palestinian friends of mine worry that there will be an attack, a conflict, a war, something that will trigger an Israeli justification to unleash mass ethnic cleansing in Gaza or the West Bank. And that's what's happened. That Israel and Zionism in a way has always looked for justifications to continue their ultimate goal, which is to have a state cleansed of Arabs. That is the vision, even amongst many so-called liberal Israeli Jews. So 1948 that was started, 1967 that was continued, and in the last 2 years it's continued again. Now Israel's not killed all the Palestinians in Gaza, they likely will not, but they've made Gaza uninhabitable. Gaza no longer exists. I mean, friends of mine look at it and say we don't even recognize anything. I mean, as you see, it's a moonscape. It basically looks like Dresden or Nagasaki. It looks like after the Americans dropped a nuclear bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So the response to the book comes out in book comes out in May 2023. It's doing pretty well. It comes out here, the US and the UK, and then October 7 happens, and the book has really exploded since. It's now out in multiple editions. It's out in 15 languages. It's including Arabic. It's become a global bestseller, which on the one hand has been pleasing. Of course, as a writer, you want to have your work read. But to be honest, in the end, I'd much rather none of this had happened. Not in terms of me personally, but clearly it's happening because there's been so much conflict and strife and ugliness in the Middle East that people are kind of longing for this information. I mean, the short thesis of the book is that Israel tests and trials weapons and surveillance tech on Palestinians first in the occupied territories, and then sells that around the world as battle tested to well over 120 countries, democracies and dictatorships. And it's just undeniable that that's happening, and it's continued since the genocide in Gaza, where you go to global arms fairs and Israeli companies that have been actively involved in the genocide are selling that technology and those weapons to other countries. They show publicly and privately footage of Palestinians being murdered by their drones, and that's a sign of, and that's somehow a good thing that a country might want to buy. And the so-called allure of Israel, what Israel has been selling for years, is two things. One, battle-tested weapons that they can sell to other countries. But also, I think it's more than that. It's also the concept of getting away with it. Because many countries look to Israel and say, how have you done that? You've been occupying a Palestinian people for the longest occupation in modern times. You committed genocide. And really, although people power is increasingly opposed to what's going on, Western states, including Australia, have pretty much backed Israel to the hilt. I mean, Australia still has been sending F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel during this whole time. Our Prime Minister, our Foreign Minister, they lie about what they're doing. They know what's going on and they lie. There's just no way to get around that. So, as far as they're concerned, genocide is not a good enough reason to stop doing this. And that speaks volumes about how many in the Western elites, politically and media, view Arabs. Jewish life is seen as much more valuable, because I guarantee if there was even the prospect of 60, 70, 80, 90,000 Jews being murdered by, I don't know, terrorist organisation, ISIS, who knows who, it wouldn't happen. Because there'd be Western military intervention, which obviously I'm glad that Jews would not be murdered on a big scale, of course I am, but when it's Arabs, well, it's just Palestinians, who cares, you know? There's so many of them. I mean, that dehumanisation runs so deep in so much of the Western space, not just politically, but in the media. I mean, you see this in the Australian media, which, with some exceptions, has been bloody awful.
Following up from that, you have discovered declassified documents about Israel's relationship with repressive regimes and information that has been largely kept within Hebrew media in Israel. Could you share some of the most striking revelations from those documents and why they remain little known outside of Israel?
One of the things I wanted to do in the book, The Palestine Laboratory, was to really uncover a history that, as you said, is mostly hidden. So many people know that after World War II, the US has been deeply complicit in much of the repression, backing and arming dictators, etc., from Africa to South America to Asia. But what is far less known is Israel was often by their side the whole time, almost like Washington's wingman. So in the book, it's everything I cover from the apartheid South African regime, which ended in 1994, and a history about that, which is very unknown but should not be, is one of the key backers of that regime was Israel. Arming, funding, training, backing. And it wasn't just a defense relationship, it was an ideological relationship. They both saw their struggles as unified. White South Africans against black South Africans, Israeli Jews against Palestinians. And they talk about this in their internal documents, which I have in the book. So that, and right to the end of that regime in 1994, when pretty much all the world had ditched South Africa, one country stood with them right to the end, Israel. And it's not surprising, because they admired them. And I see, in some ways, today, the relationship between Israel and India in a similar way. That India, in my view, is an increasingly chauvinist country, discriminates against non-Hindus, particularly Muslims. And the relationship between those two countries, Israel and India, is, yes, defense relationship, weapons, but also it's ideological. A similar belief in dehumanizing either Muslims in India or Palestinians in Palestine. Other revelations in the book, so when Pinochet took over in a coup in Chile in 1973, on September 11 actually, the US backed that coup, but Israel was by their side, supported them, armed them, to the point at one point where Israel was giving more weapons than the Americans were. And there are so many other examples. Guatemala committed a genocide in the 1980s, and Israel was training and arming the forces that committed that against the indigenous population. I talk about how in Rwanda in the genocide in 1994, Israel was arming the side that was committing the genocide. Myanmar, which in the last 10 years, according to the UN, has committed a genocide against the Rohingya Muslim population. Israel was backing that regime, arming them, training them, giving them communication equipment and weapons. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So, yes, the arms industry is amoral by definition. America sells weapons, Russia, China. They're all doing it immorally. I'm not suggesting that they don't. But Israel claims, falsely, to be this kind of moral example to the world. In the ashes of the Holocaust, we rose up as a state and are a moral beacon. Well, A, you're committing genocide against Palestinians, but as bad, you're backing repressive states around the world and continue to do so. The weapons industry in Israel is worth, the last figures we have is close to $15 billion US. Israel's the 8th biggest arms dealer in the world, which is amazing for a really tiny country. And that arms industry, I think, sustains Israel in many, many ways, as its economy at times during endless war has suffered.
Okay, moving on. A ceasefire was announced, and it's supposed to be taking place right now. Is it being upheld, and what does this mean for the region?
Ceasefire. There is less violence in general than there was before the ceasefire. Yes, sort of. Although, we're sitting here in the last 24, 48 hours, there's over 100 Palestinians murdered by Israel, civilians in Gaza.
Which is similar figures to pre-ceasefire.
Indeed. Yeah. So, look, the idea that Arab dictatorships, Tony Blair, Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, have the best interests of the Palestinians at heart, please. I'm obviously glad that there is a slightly less murder and killing and pillaging than there was before. Anyone would support that. But if you listen to what the Israeli officials are saying, what Netanyahu is saying, what the Israeli media is often saying, there is a belief that in some ways the war was a failure from their perspective. Because Hamas still exists. In fact, my understanding is Hamas, in fact, is thriving. They are recruiting. Not surprising, when you've destroyed a whole territory, it's an easier sell for an insurgency to build a guerrilla force. And yes, the hostages have been released. I mean, obviously, Israel still holds many, many Palestinian hostages, which are called prisoners, but many of them are actual hostages, never been charged with a crime in the very failing Israeli court. So, and my fear is longer term, the so-called vision of this peace plan, if you can call it that, Trump's peace plan, is a quasi-occupation. When I say quasi, as in Israel still holds more than 50% of territory in Gaza. And the so-called vision is to maybe support some kind of redevelopment or building in those areas, while at the same time, Israel is funding 4 militias in Gaza, Palestinians, training them, arming them, funding them to, I guess, fight the war in a different way against Hamas. And I fear that the vision, if you can call it that, is kind of, and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who is deeply involved in huge amounts of particularly Gulf money, their vision is kind of like Dubai. Now, Dubai is very shiny and nice if you don't look below the surface, but Dubai, Abu Dhabi, much of the Gulf, these are cities built by slaves, maintained by slaves. When I say slaves, mostly from South Asia, who were brought over, treated horribly, often kept in slave-like conditions. And often tourists don't see that when they go to the shining, beautiful hotels in Dubai and have their lovely food, which I've done that too. I mean, I've been to Dubai a number of times, but I wouldn't go there for a holiday. And it's worth saying, just in relation to that, that the glittering lights that the UAE is selling, both in Gaza and beyond, needs to be challenged, not least because they are backing a genocidal force now in Sudan. And the idea that the UAE would somehow be the vision, who are key backers of what Trump is doing in Gaza, they're the ones who have the vision. If their vision is Dubai or Abu Dhabi, no thank you. And I don't think most Palestinians will accept that.
So moving on to a different point now. You left mainstream Australian media and became an independent journalist. Why?
Well, I guess I have a foot kind of in both. I have a foot sort of in some mainstream media if they invite me. It's interesting, the last 2 years since October 7, I had lots of massive amounts of global media interest in my work, but not that much in Australia. Now, I don't think there's some grand conspiracy to keep me out. I don't think they think about me that much, but it is revealing.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Do you want to repeat that?
Yeah. I don't think there's some grand conspiracy to keep me out of the Australian media. I don't think it's that at all. And it's not like I'm ever going to be called by the Murdoch press and they can go jump in the lake anyway. But ABC, for example, or Sydney Morning Herald, or I guess SBS, they're not calling. Now, I mean, who knows why that is? Again, I'm not losing sleep over this, but I think, look, increasingly in the last years, this was happening before October 7, I realised that there is a real crisis of, not confidence, but crisis of legitimacy in much of the mainstream media on lots of issues. Israel-Palestine's one of them. The reporting on race, not least the deep Islamophobia in Australia, which I think much of the media, with some exceptions, does a really bad job of addressing. The lack of real diversity within the Australian media, the profound racism that exists within media organisations. There was a report that came out not that long ago within the ABC, which found profound racism within that organisations towards people of colour, non-white journalists. And I have friends of mine who work there who tell me that's absolutely true. Doesn't mean those organisations never do good work. They do. There are some good journalists there doing good work. I'm not saying any of that. They do. So I guess for me, being an independent journalist meant I answer to nobody. Obviously, financially, I don't have a regular income, so to speak, so I have to earn a living through commissions and interviews and whatever it may be. But in theory, at least, it's harder to silence me. I mean, yes, I could be taken off all social media platforms tomorrow, I mean, this is a opaque process, and who knows what Mark Zuckerberg thinks when he wakes up in the morning, right? I mean, I've got no power over that. But I think people who have independent voices and thinking, I think increasingly realise that making a home for themselves in the mainstream media is a fool's game, which is why I think in the last years, particularly in Australia, America and elsewhere, you've seen this explosion of independent press. In Australia, it could be Deep Cut News, or We Used to Be Journos, or I'm co-editor of Declassified Australia, which has done investigative journalism around Australia's relationship with the world and done a lot of breaking stories around Australia sending F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel. And people are looking for that information because they're not finding it in the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, wherever it may be. And the audiences for those outlets, particularly with younger people, is dying. And I think most of those outlets don't know how to address it. They don't seem that interested in addressing it, even though they say they are. And therefore, independent media, assuming it's viable and is supported by the public, which it needs to be, is a very important perspective to hear, whether it's about Palestine, whether it's about the growing authoritarianism in the US, whether it's the growth of the far right across Europe, whether it's the growing attacks against Muslims across Europe, whatever the issues may be. So often the mainstream press just doesn't address that. So you have to find other ways.
Christian Zionism, what's your thoughts on that?
Evangelicals in America who support Israel are in far greater numbers than the Jews who do. Christian Zionism ideology is very much about end times. I mean, really, when it boils down to it, people who believe in this, that their concept is that all the Jews get put in one particular place, the Messiah comes back, and if you're not believing in that, you die. Now, the idea that Jews, let alone anyone else, would partner with these people is insane because they're not looking out for our interests, I can assure you of that. Now, I think those Jewish groups who partner with these organizations say, well, a lot of people don't like us these days. These guys love us. We'll just partner with them. But I think it's deeply rooted in actual real anti-Semitism and often ugliness and racism towards Islam as well. And I think that growing alliance between, as I was saying before, the global far right and Israel is partly to do with the growth of evangelical far right ideology, which is a belief that all the land in Israel, including Palestine, is for the Jews alone. And I think, I've said this for a while, that Israel's vision, so to speak, is to have millions of settlers in the West Bank. There's now roughly 800,000. But there aren't enough Jews in the world who want to do that. There just aren't that many of us. And I think it's very conceivable in years to come you're going to have evangelicals who Israel accepts because they're pro-Israel as moving to the West Bank, which already is happening, but in far greater numbers. And a lot of those. Now, will millions of them move? I don't know, but it's conceivable to me that some will. So I think Christian Zionism is a deeply discriminatory, racist, problematic ideology. It's on the one hand seen in the mainstream as quite fringe, but its numbers suggest that in fact in some parts of the world, particularly the US, it's growing. But to Jews, I would say these people are not our friends.
Mm-hmm. What can Jewish people do more to support the Palestinian cause?
I get Jews writing to me a lot, as you can probably imagine, mostly younger Jews who are disillusioned with what Israel is, what the mainstream Jewish community has been supporting in the last 2 years, blind support for Israel. We don't know the exact number, but there are a number of Australians who have been fighting in Gaza for Israel. No one knows the exact number of people. We're not talking about thousands, but maybe dozens or hundreds. And that's often encouraged within elements of the Jewish community. I think what a lot of Jews are writing to me about is saying we want to find our voice to get past the fear that we have, because a lot of Jews say to me, if we speak out within our family, social media, we'll be ostracized from Friday night dinners, Shabbat dinners, or... Now, on the one hand, I have sympathy for that. I'm not saying someone should cut off all ties with their family, of course. It's not for me to say that. On the other hand, I say to people, often in a friendly way, if now is not the time to speak out, when is? Mm-hmm. I mean, like, this is the moment where Israel has just committed genocide against Palestinians in the deluded belief that that's somehow going to bring them security or safety or whatever the justification is. Now is the time to speak out. So that conversation might start with your family. That might start with being involved in the Jewish Council of Australia, for example. It might be in speaking, going to rallies. It might be finding different friends. It might be Jewish or non-Jewish. So, I mean, to me, the question of Palestine, in a way, as I often have argued, what happens in Palestine doesn't stay there. So yes, what's happening to Palestinians is horrific and nothing is taken away from that. But the issue, what's happening in Palestine, is about so much more than that. It is, in the context of what Jews can do, being involved in the reckoning about what Jews have done, what Jews have supported, what Jews are encouraging should happen more of, and questioning that silence that still exists in much of the Jewish community. Who are we to tell Israel what to do? We're sitting in Sydney, we're in London, we're in New York. It's not my place to tell Israel how to conduct policy. Right, so they commit genocide, you're just going to stay silent, are you? Really? This is the moral reckoning that's required. And some in the Jewish community are up for that and some are not. And I think they need to be shamed into addressing it, which myself and others have every intention of doing.
Antony, thank you for giving us your time here today.
My
it was
pleasure.
quite profound and insightful. Hopefully we have more conversations with you in the near future. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.